I want to talk about prayer. Of course, I always want to talk about prayer. But in order to do so, first we have to talk about science fiction, space travel, and physics. In science fiction, when an author wants to write about spaceships traveling between the stars and arriving in any reasonable amount of time, they have to come up with a way for them to travel faster than light. But this is impossible, knowing what we know about physics and Einstein's special relativity, so science fiction authors must invent means of faster than light travel that stretch the laws of physics, hopefully not beyond the breaking point of credulity. Douglas Adams, in his humorous Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, sidestepped this problem. His ships were propelled by an improbability drive that drew power from the sheer preposterousness of the whole endeavor. But most authors have to wrestle with this in a way that is, for lack of a better word, more down to earth. In Star Trek, one of my favorite science fiction properties, the ships travel using a warp drive. This works by warping the fabric of space-time to bring two seemingly faraway places closer together. If you imagine two dots on a piece of paper, instead of drawing a line between them, you bend the paper to bring one dot right next to the other. Warp drives have appeared in science fiction since the 1950s, but entered the mainstream with Star Trek. But I would like to argue tonight that the concept of warping space to travel easily between two places was not invented by the great science fiction writers of the 20th century, nor by astrophysicists, but by the rabbis writing the Talmud in the 5th century of the Common Era. The rabbis have fanciful imaginations that should be a source of envy to any writer of speculative fiction. When they encounter a problem in the text of the Torah, or even just a wayward detail that creates some interpretive ambiguity, the rabbis invent brave new worlds to address seemingly mundane issues. Take, for instance, one vowel in this week's Torah portion that prompts the rabbis to invent a scientifically plausible means of faster-than-light travel. Parshat Vayetze opens with these words: Jacob left Beersheba, and he went to Haran. He came upon the place, and he stopped there for the night because the sun had set. This is the preamble to the story of Jacob's dream of a ladder to heaven. But even in this simple description, the rabbis raised at least 3 questions. The first thing they notice is that it says ba makom, the place, and not be makom, a place. So it seems that this is a particular place, maybe of some significance, but it's not named. Second, they notice that the sequence of the clauses is weird. He seems to go to Haran and then come back to a different place. You would think that it would be in the other order. He was traveling, he came upon a place, and then he went on his way to Haran, where he ends up. And finally, the Torah uses a strange word for encounter, vayifga. When the rabbis encounter ambiguous words, they like to go look for other places where that word appears. The rabbis connect vayifga to another place where it's used in the book of Jeremiah, where it means not to discover, but to pray. So the rabbis posit that not only had Jacob come upon a particular place, but that he prayed there. But now the plot has only thickened. Where and why did Jacob pray? Well, we can also look for that word bamakom, the place, in other verses from the Torah. That word appeared 2 generations before, where it says that Abraham arrived at the place where he would sacrifice Isaac, Mount Moriah. The rabbis like this connection because Moriah would later become the location for the temple in Jerusalem, so of course he would want to pray there. So now we know that Jacob not only arrived at Mount Moriah, but also that he prayed in the same place that Abraham had once prayed. But what about the issue with the sequence? Why does it say that he went to Haran and then, I guess, backtracked to Moriah? And here is where the rabbis write their science fiction story. Jacob knew that it was a special mitzvah to pray in the same place that his father or grandfather had prayed. But only after Jacob reached his destination in Haran did it occur to him that he might have passed such a place on his journey and missed that opportunity. So he resolves that he is going to have to turn around and go back. The moment he decided to return, a miracle happened. And the earth collapsed a little bit so that Mount Moriah was right next to where he was standing. He needed only to turn around, step over the now small chasm to the spot where Abraham had sacrificed the ram, not Isaac, and immediately he began to pray. All of this, I promise you, in the Talmud. And thus, the rabbis have invented history's first warp drive, powered in this case by the intention to pray. Now, the rabbis are having fun here. They are solving problems that they themselves created, and in doing so, making fantastical stories about moving mountains. But any reader of science fiction knows that the best stories are not just fun or imaginative, they are about something. So what, we might wonder, is this story about? This is the question that bothered the Sfat Emet, the 19th century Hasidic master. He wonders, what is the connection between the earth collapsing for Isaac and the prayer that he offered? The Sfat Emet concluded that the story comes to teach us that through the force of will, a person is able to awaken the holiness of God in any place. For him, the key element in this story is Jacob's will, his desire to pray in the place of his ancestors. You might have thought, as Jacob did, that the place was what was really important, that there's some sort of special mojo from praying in that same spot. But not so, says the Sfat Emet. What matters most is that you intend to pray with your whole heart. After that, the impact of where you pray is negligible. Prayer is hard. And I can identify with what the Sfat Emet is saying here. We ascribe to our forebears a certain spiritual authenticity that we feel we could never live up to. We might think back to our ancestors and assume that they must have connected to Judaism on some deep level that will always be inaccessible to us. Or maybe we did not even have Jewish ancestors or religious ancestors, and we look at these words and feel a great chasm between ourselves and some idealized prayer experience. We feel like Jacob in Haran, so far away from this imagined world of religious legitimacy. We might feel strongly about the spaces where our forebears prayed, or about the melodies they sung, or the language they used. Some of that comes from a sense of familiarity and comfort that is vital to prayer. But maybe some of that also comes from a sense of spiritual imposter syndrome. How they prayed was right and holy, and how we pray feels less so. Perhaps you remember the movie Keeping the Faith from 2000, where Ben Stiller and Ed Norton played a young rabbi and priest who were best friends. In one scene in the movie, the rabbi is trying to inspire his much stuffier than this congregation to sing. And so he invites the local gospel choir to lead them in a rousing rendition of Ein Keloheinu. It was meant to show that Stiller is not your parents' Judaism kind of rabbi. Shortly after the movie came out, I was at a Jewish educators conference. There were some people going around telling everyone they should boycott the movie. How dare they present such a holy song in such a frivolous manner? People were incensed. But I remember one rabbi I respected finding the whole debate ridiculous. He said, you know the melody of Ein Keloheinu is adapted from a German drinking song, right? Sometimes the melodies and traditions we think come from Abraham and Jacob are actually much newer. This is not an argument against nostalgia in prayer. There is a great power in hearing familiar melodies and refrains. They transport us and they connect us to previous generations. But what the Sfat Emet is saying is that they do these things only when we turn to them with the intention to connect. The transformative power is not in the place or the melody, but rather in our desire to connect with them. When Jacob wanted to commune with the prayers of his ancestors, he finds himself right where he needs to be. The expanse of prayer can be great. The words on the page may seem so foreign to us, and not just because they are in Hebrew. But the Sfat Emet teaches that the essential mode of prayer is yearning. It's striving to reach beyond ourselves. We reach backward towards the generations that have come before us, all the way back to Jacob, to Abraham. We reach inward to find our true selves and to listen to the voice of conscience within us. And we reach out towards the infinite, towards a vastness beyond our comprehension that perhaps we call God. And the surprising and wonderful discovery of prayer is that sometimes, when we need it most, just that act of reaching out moves the mountain. We find that the distance we thought was great has collapsed, that the infinite was closer to us than we could have imagined. The first step of connecting to prayer is wanting to connect to prayer, and the steps after that are easier than we imagine. There is a moment in the Yom Kippur liturgy near the end of the final service of Ne'ilah. After all the repenting that we have done, we come to a new prayer. It's called Atat Noten Yad. God reaches out God's hand. After a day of fasting and praying, after all the hard work, we turn the page and there is God reaching out God's hand. You might have been worried, am I doing it right? Do these prayers even mean anything to me? Do I even believe any of this? But there God was all along on page 654, reaching out God's hand. The distance that we thought was unbridgeable between us and our ancestors, between us and ourselves, between us and God, perhaps it was not so great after all. If you approach the act of prayer with honest intention, God is always there, reaching out a hand. Many works of science fiction posit worlds at the edges of our imagination, worlds very distant from our own. But the best works of science fiction describe those worlds in a way that seems familiar, like we could get there if we tried. Prayer, at its core, does the same thing. It posits a world as it could be. It uses images of creation and revelation and redemption. It speaks to the infinite, the unknowable, the transcendent. And sitting here in our pews, these ideas could seem as far away from our lives as starships in a distant galaxy. But the power of prayer is that it is like a warp drive. It bends those distances until what was far away is very close. The world as it could be seems plausible. These ideas that seem so foreign are suddenly familiar and relatable. God, who is infinite, is now also reaching out a hand, close enough for us to take it. The Sfat Emet ends his commentary on our verse by talking about the fact that Jacob's earth-warping prayer takes place in the darkness, after the sun has set. He says, "From this we learn that for every person with authentic reaching, there is no place where one is unable to feel the inner light." Prayer is not an act of performing words like the script of a play. Prayer is not an act of repeating a script that belonged only to those who came before. Prayer is an act of yearning, of reaching, of aspiring and imagining. And when we turn to that task with true intention, we find it may be possible to boldly travel beyond what we ever thought possible. Shabbat Shalom.